So, good evening again from my side. My name is Jan Hüsken. I'm a historian and researcher at the German Lost Art Foundation. And with my own background in mission, history, and colonialism, I'm very glad that we have this evening such an interesting discussion with four colleagues with their an expertise in very different fields in mission history, so that this will provide us with a good overview and an interesting starting point for our discussion. Before I begin to introduce this evening's topic to you, I will start with some technical advice. This meeting is being recorded, and you can so that you can use it later on can take a look at it later on our event documentation. So if you won't like to be recorded, just turn down your camera. Yeah, as would like as well that you appreciate it if you mute your microphone in case you are not talking at the moment. Everything's fine. And if you would like to join our discussion later, you can give us a hands up in the WebEx meeting or put your question in the chat. We have organized this evening's discussion as a panel discussion. We have 4 panelists that will present, each of them, his point of view on the topic of mission and colonialism and forms of collecting by missionaries. And afterwards, we will jump in a more general discussion. There you have as well the chance to raise some questions. As I said, today's topic is missionary collecting in colonial context, aspects of the relationship between mission and colonialism. And this reflects the important point missionaries as collectors have in ethnological collections, anthropological collections, natural history collections, and of course several own collections by missionaries. And this topic is more and more present in our research project we fund, but as well, Markus, Scholz, and I, for example, are the organizers of the working group on missionary collections in the working group of colonial context. And we have already 40 members within this working group that highlights the important need of discussion on the topic of mission and collecting. And this is a good chance to highlight you as well. Sorry, I have. We organized a workshop in June on the topic of defining missionary collections, and recently the results of his workshops have been published in the blog of the German Lost Art Foundation. And I would like to thank Nicole Rumert that she wrote a small report on our discussions in the blog.
Excuse me, can I ask a quick technical question? How can I mute myself?
I should be able to mute you.
Please do so.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Gabriele. Problem solved. Yes. And here's the link to the blog post in case you are interested in the working group's discussion on missions and missionary forms of collecting. I would now like to introduce the panelists for today, and I will do this in alphabetical order. I start with Dr. Eeva-Kristiina Nylander. She is principal investigator in the research project The Sami Collection at the Museum Europäischer Kulturen, a multi-perspective approach of provenance research funded by the German Lost Art Foundation. Her research focuses on Sami material culture, research ethics, and repatriation issues. She recently finished her dissertation From Repatriation to Rematriation, Dismantling the Attitudes and Potentials Behind the Repatriation of Sami Heritage, that discusses several aspects of the return of Sami cultural heritage in Finland. Our next discussant is Dr. Gabriele Richter. She is lecturer at the Institute for Study of Religion at the University of Bremen. Her research focuses on the history of mission and colonialism in Oceania, especially Papua New Guinea. Her dissertation, Occupying Land and People, Wilhelm Bergmann in Shimbu, New Guinea, 1928 to 1939, was published in 2016 by the University of Papua New Guinea Press. Now I would like to introduce you to Markus Scholz. Dr. Markus Scholz is Research Associate at the Institute for World Church and Mission at the Philosophical and Theological High School St. George in Frankfurt. He is Principal Investigator in a research project on mission collections by religious orders in Germany. His research focuses on Catholic missions in the Americas. His doctoral thesis was on the subject of Franciscan missionaries in Peru. And finally, I would like to introduce Dr. Ohiniko Toffa. He is lecturer at the University of Leipzig and teaches post-colonial theory at the Department of African Studies. He has been the principal investigator in the project Provenience of Colonial Collections from Togo in the Ethnographic Collections of Saxony, funded by the German Lost Art Foundation. His dissertation Christliche Moral und koloniale Herrschaft in Togo, die Missionskonzeption Franz Michael Zahns, has recently been published by Transcript Publishers in Bielefeld. And he will begin a post of as provenance researcher at the State Museums of Berlin in 2024. So congratulations for this new position. And as we can already see, we have quite a very great number of experts for today's discussion with very different regional and interdisciplinary perspectives. And we will now start with their input on mission, the topic of missions and collection. So each of them has the possibility to present her ideas. And I will now share my screen again. And would kindly ask Eeva-Kristiina to begin.
Yes, hello, good evening everyone, and warm greetings from Inari from the Sami land, Sápmi. I'm going to speak today about the relationship between missionary work and the Sami cultural heritage and collecting the Sami cultural heritage. Now, at first, I should mention that the Sami cultural heritage or Sami people are divided today between 4 nation states, the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Sweden and Norway, and in addition, Russia. So I can only give you a very brief description about the missionary activity and also the Christianization of the Sami people. Because there are actually 4 churches that have been influencing in the Russian area of the Kola Peninsula, the Russian Orthodox Church, and then also the Catholic Church, mainly in the coastal area of the Ice Sea in today's Norway. Then, of course, the Lutheran, after the the Lutheran Church then, and then missionary work. And for example, today the Scholz Sami people are also Russian or Orthodox, but they belong to the Church of Constantinople and not under the Russian Orthodox Church. So basically, we are talking about the first missionary work began already between 13th and 14th century, mainly in the Norwegian coast. As the Scholz Sami and East Sami people in Kola Peninsula were Christianized, or the work began in 15th century. In Sweden and of course Finland was at that time a part of Sweden. Gustav Vasa activated in the 16th century by nominating priests that had the obligation to work in Lapland. And later on, Karl IX, great warrior king, took a very tight grip on the Sami villages and on the areas in Lapland in the beginning of 17th century. And in Norwegian area, Norway was a part of Denmark. The most strongest influence became with the pietistic movement in the 18th century, and especially by a priest called Thomas von Westen, and Sami mission established by the king at that time in Denmark. However, the it can be said that the Sami area was colonized by the church, and churches were established in the Sami area to gain power over the areas. The areas were rich in for example, in furs. So the kings and royal people in Europe, they desired to wear these fur coats, and that's why it became very important area. But also, in order for Sweden, for example, to be a great nation state and a great power, dried fish was needed. So these are one of the reasons why the area became very important. So the Sami area basically was colonized by the help of the church, and with the church became taxation, legal structures, and also organized and regulated markets in the north. This object that or maybe it's not right to say that it's an object, it's a sacred drum. This one is in Leipzig, in Grassi Museum, and as you can see, it's not very easy to notice the drawings or the depictions on the drum, and that's why I have included this drawing of this drum on the side. This drum became from so-called Kemi Lappmark, which was an administrative area in today's Finland, and this drum came to the collections in Leipzig via processes that we do not need, but the person who took it to Stockholm was a famous warlord, Erik von Fleming, who acted in the Finnish military. He died in 1650. So this is one of the examples that is an example of this early collecting by the church and by the missionaries. And this drum is the maybe most famous example, as the Sami people were denied their traditional way of thinking and being, the traditional philosophy and spirituality. And for example, they were forced to get or break the relationship with the ancestors, which were really important. So these drums were taken by priests, by missionaries, but also in legal proceedings. And this happened in such a way that in today's Sápmi, there are only 5 drums in Sami museums. All of them have been repatriated. So in the same time that the whole Sami area was cleansed from the drums of the people, these drums were put to curiosity cabinets and given as gifts, for example, to noble people. And There are at this time 74 drums, according to our knowledge, in the world. The largest owners are the Swedish large museums, the Nordic Museum and the State Historical Museum. But 15 examples of these drums are in German museum. And this is one example. And this kind of drums from the Kemi-Lappmark administrative area, there are only 2 left in the world, because these drums were so large that the priest who was a vicar in that area, he thought that these drums were so big that they could not be transported to Stockholm, which was the capital at that time, but they should be burnt on site. So I think this object really strongly narrates about the kind of maybe, well, destroying another people's worldview and taking away the objects. And even today, the Sami people are struggling to get them back. And just to let you know, if you have not noticed, a couple of weeks ago, Mining and Museum gave one of the drums back to the South Sami Museum. So there is a positive thing ongoing, as these drums, of course, they are a huge representation of the colonial activity in the Sami land. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your example, and yeah, I guess it highlights very well the long history of mission and the possibilities to the confiscation by missionaries of religious objects and their influence on local traditional religions. And now I go to our next presenter. Next slide. So, thank you. Gabriele, now it's your turn.
All right. So my focus is on Papua New Guinea highlands of what is now often called Simbo or Chimbo regions in the 1930s. And the peculiar thing about this region is that German missionaries were in Papua New Guinea still after Germany turned Australian or became under Australian rule after World War I, and this made my research interesting in terms of looking at archival materials. So very critical archival material from the Australian side, so to say. So what you can see is something I will say a little bit about later. This is just an example of a stone that comes from that region. It's not particularly in a German museum, but as you can see, it's a stone from the region that I researched, the Chimbo region. And to give you a little bit of a context, what kind of mission work it was, I want to quote an Australian historian named Firth, who said that the mission society, quote, was a state within a state. So the missionaries tried to work decidedly in an area where the colonial interest was less significant, which was already the strategy during colonial times. And to use the quote again, or to quote him again, the Mission Society was organizing an alternative church-based form of village government, Christianized villages, even where some inhabitants remained heathens, became theocracies under the rule of church elders and subject to the decision of congregational meetings, the secular penalties, including imprisonment, thrashing, and hard labor. So I'm focusing on a context from the Pacific where a German Lutheran Mission Society sort of created a state within a state. I agree with this statement. And so this author, I would say, a theocratic authoritarian rule is something I coined as religious colonialism. So in the setting of the 1930s, when the highlands of Papua New Guineans became an El Dorado for explorers, amongst them was a very pious German missionary whose name was Willy Bergmann or Wilhelm Bergmann. My research is based first and foremost on his autobiography or autobiographical accounts and archival material from all sorts of places. And he named the mission enterprise an occupation of land and people. And it's important to say that this was also a time when a lot of the missionaries were involved also in Nazi ideology. So there is a kind of melting of different factors if you look at that. So the picture that you can see again is a stone from the Timber region. If you want to know more about stones, Pamela Swetling's publications are really good for learning something about that. And so how got these stones and other artifacts, of course, and end up in German museums, in German mission collections? This is what I want to talk about. So the mission project, so to say, in the eyes of the missionaries, not all traditions, of course, were bad, and some of them were, of course, called named Heathen, and this always involved a sort of warfare against what, as Bergmann would say, warfare against heathendom. So this understanding of conflict, consequently a rhetoric of him and others, had a great impact on the approach to local traditions. And what was named religion could be removed. And of course, this involved especially powerful objects. Sometimes they were even exposed by Lutheran New Guinean missionaries, or then called helpers to the mission, to women in order to sort of disempower these items. So there are source findings that show that. So in the mission field, the pressure to convert Christianity was very high, and the reality was, of course, very complicated. So, for instance, competing with the Catholic mission societies in the so-called frontier mission region often involved, let's say, strategies that made it more simple to convert. And sometimes this meant that not everybody in the community, even if it was a collective mission work, not everybody in the community already converted to Christianity, but the items were already of some sort of interest to the whole community. But once a community converted, of course, as the missionaries said, the central signs of heathendom were given to the missionaries either to destroy or to be taken away, and be taken away, of course, meant to be given to Europe. When you look at the sources, sometimes this also involved stealing by local missionaries. As far as I know, not of European missionaries, at least not from the sources. But I don't know, or the sources don't say if the missionaries knew about this when the local missionaries were involved with that. But most often also the newly converted were happy that the missionaries took away those items. So I have also a letter quoted in an in his autobiography, saying how happy he was that the missionary took the item. So often coming to sort of the time now, I mean, people were asking me in Papua New Guinea, and I heard of others being asked to talk about these items and maybe giving them back to communities in Papua New Guinea. A problem or an interest, of course, in that context is that the missionaries sold the items to the museums. So in the eyes of the museums, those items were bought. And in the mission context, there are many, many questions about whether you should do that or not. As far as I know or remember those discussions, that it could spark violent conflicts. So it has many layers, those discussions. And I was a part of an Erasmus Plus, or I am part of an Erasmus exchange program between academics from Papua New Guinea and Germany. And indeed, there are many, many questions. So, for instance, the sensitivities of such powerful items being claimed for restitutions. There's the question of ownership. Who owns something like that after such a long time? Who would be sort of the person to be, or the community to own that? But there are also questions surrounding the authority to deal with these items. Do you need to be an elder? Do you need to be initiated, a man, a woman? What about the role of the National Museum? What about the role of, I don't know, states owners in Germany nowadays? So there are many, many questions, and I hope some of those questions we can at least, somehow address. And but still, for me, to come to a conclusion, the most haunting question, or the most interesting question, is, was it right to take those items just because the people were told that they did something in order to become Christians? So if you believe that, then there was no stealing, there was no unrightful taking back. But if you question the Christian narrative, then there is something problematic about the taking. So there are many questions about that, and yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I guess it's a good starting point for the discussion later to deal with this so-called religious colonialism and all the problems in phases of later return questions of property, and so on. And I would now like to go to our next presenter, to Ohini Toffa. And Ohini, are you? Ohini.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Hello, Ohini. Just give me a sign when I should point to the next slide.
Yeah, okay. I thought I was the last one, and I'm a little bit surprised to be now on there.
Sorry, my mistake. Sorry, I made the presentation on the wrong part. Sorry.
Thank you for inviting me to speak here. I want to speak about an object collected by a German trader in the Dresden Museum. But before that, I will show two pictures. The first one is a picture which had been taken in the south of Togo, and is showing what we call in the south of Togo, Ataku. Yes. This is Ataku. Ataku is the German missionary Westermann translates Ataku with paprika, pfeffer. I think he's not wrong by translating it like that. Ataku has in the communities, Ewe communities, many diverse use or roles. It can be used to heal. It can be used also to cook. But in the healing function, he is a very predominant article of the person we call Bokono, or native doctor in Nigeria. Ataku can be used and other many kind of plants as a patima can be used also to set up what had been called joka or ebo. Can you bring me to the image of patima or ataku? This is patima. Patima is a purification herbs. The people called as Bokono or native doctor in Bokono in Togo used to heal people. Ataku has the same function. When you say Ataku in Lomé today or in certain village, people can react to you with aversion because they consider Ataku in relation to Joka or Ebo, and they can treat you as Aze, and Aze is what we can call in English witchcraft. To use them, they ground them into powder. And now I am going to show you the object I am going to talk about. Yes, this is the object I am going to talk about. And you will see why I show Ataku or Patima before. These objects have been collected by Ernst Günchow. This is a kind of joker I am talking about. It has been collected in 1910 from the hinterland of Togo. The museum description is fetisch. Den Hals getragen, schützt es vor feindlichen Schwerthieben. Fetisch. Akbo is to wear on the neck and preserve against sword slash. The description of this museum object may be right, but I miss in this description a logical articulation of the cultural and spiritual meaning of what had become fetish. Maybe they try to describe something which can heal from wounds caused by sword. I think personally, there should be a powder in this joker or a bow which have a heavy healing or antibiotic function. And I will not be surprised if we find in this object a taku or a patima powder. Akbo is the real pronunciation, mean protection, barrier. For the owner, who is surely a hunter, it is something he used to wear when he is on hunting and can cure himself when he got attacked. Gucho bought this akpo in the time where the Christian faith was in a terrible crisis in European countries, in the metropole. And the Christian faith was the base, the moral base on which this akpo has been called fetish. It is also the value on the base of which the spiritualities of colonized people have been degraded, demolished, and commercialized. Westermann said the gods are dying. Those and other histories and memories are what missionary collection can deliver and are delivering when we research them. The making of paganism or fetishism related to the effect of conversions in the context of mission. Conversions means always in the country where I come from, abandoning the paganism to choose the good way of life of the Christian and European one. The missionary collections also offer the history of cultural transformation, the transformation of values in the colony, and the production of new moral by changing things which once would have been good in bad. The missionary collections are telling us the history of the colonial moral, and they are structuring the colonial power. They are proof of what the German colonial politician Wilhelm Heinrich Solf was already saying in 1919 in his book about his political legacy. Kolonisieren is missionieren. In English, colonizing means missionizing. And the collections are explicating what the German theologian Paul Rohrbach called in his book Moralische Eroberung, moral conquest, or moral domination, or domination through moral values. So it was all about conquest. It was all about domination and control. It was all about power. The symbol of this colonial power as the victory of the light on darkness is related or can be related to every single object in a missionary collections. They are, for those who collected them in a certain way, trophies. To this power or trophies are closely connected history of subjectivities, the changing of personalities, as Robert Kwame, one of the Eeva-Kristiina, reported it from the colonial time. A woman priest was devoted to her fetish. Can you put this code? A woman priest was devoted to her fetish, though she lost her children one after all. After the last passed away, the woman was angry and said, "You fetish, you are betraying me. Get away from me." The fetish was indeed thrown away, and it was burned in presence of Christians. The woman converted to Christianity. Also, the priest of the famous idol, Kulturgutverluste, chose the Christian faith, and this was not the end. As there is nobody else in his family who can take over the worshipping of the Kulturgutverluste, it was destroyed. That was something exceptional. Other priests tried to convince him to give up on his decision to convert to Christian faith. But it will be because it will be a shame for them. But the man stayed with his mind. After he was baptized, the fetish things were burned as trophies, celebrating the victory of Christianism by processing around the city with joyful song. In this report of an Eeva-Kristiina, the conversion as changing personality and constructing new subjectivities appear clearly and remain connected to the burning rituals, the celebration of victory, trophies. And that is why missionary collections are also the place where we research and work on violences, subjectivities, and violences done to oneself by renouncing its well-known spiritual and religious value and taking a new one. This brings to reconstruction of the colonial violence in its different phases: frontal, vertical, horizontal. The missionary collections permit also to address ignorance. Did Robert Kwame know that in that time he was converting his people and motivating them to choose Christianity? The Christianity is facing serious critique in Germany. Did he know the history of the crimes committed by the Christianism in its educational institution in Europe? How did he know about racism justified by the Christian masters on impeaching intercultural marriage between white and black in the colonial time? In which sense all those Christian positions are defendable? If there is something bad to say about the religions of his fellows, there is also a lot to say about his new faith in Christianism. Researching subjectivities through and with missionary collections is reconstructing the motivation or the justification of the collecting in the mission context as colonial practice, deploying violence everywhere. To make my mind clear about the word violence, I want to quote the Holy Bible beyond any theological interpretation in Matthew 11 to 12. And from the day of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffered violence, and the violence take it by force. The missionary collections need to criticize the concept of the holy or healing violence. The healing violence based on the Christian faith comes through the definition of paganism, fetishism, and their criminalization in the colonial time to a clear understanding. Mr. Gruner justified the death sentence of the chief priest Obosonfo in 1895 with the fact that this priest, was practicing a fanatic fetishism. So, power relations, subjectivities, and violence through and with missionary collection are closely connected with the question of provenance. Provenances are subjectivities, the history of the mechanism and the colonial moral defined by the colonial provenance. And finally, the provenance research with missionary collections will try to restore history and memories and enable the healing process of opened wounds, because it's still legitimate to ask, who is the barbarian or who is the civilized one? The missionary who lied or whose God is so jealous to kill all other gods, or the colonizer who cuts heads and collects them to sell them to museums, or the traditional priest in the Eeva region trying to help himself with the power of the nature, but using at the same time this power to harm other people. Who is bad? What was really the meaning of bad in colonial time? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ohini, for pointing out the importance of violence in conversion processes, and I guess especially the violence in the so-called civilizing missions. I have seen the hand, but no, it's not. And I would like to go on to, and again, I apologize for not being able to put you in the right alphabetical order, but now I welcome Markus Scholz with his contribution.
Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you for setting up this event, which I think is a good opportunity to highlight the topic of missionary collecting and its relevance for the history of anthropology and for Western museum collections. And I'm also glad to be here today because the Americas, as the region I focus on, haven't been to the foreign debate on collections from colonial contexts neither. And so this might be an opportunity to draw more attention to the Western Hemisphere in this regard. As you know, the Americas have a long colonial history that goes back to the 16th century, and they play an important role in the history of Western expansion in the early modern period. And in this context, Christian missions and evangelizations were crucial to legitimize the colonial rule of Spain and Portugal. Papal bulls, by papal bulls, Pope Alexander VI granted the overseas territories to the Catholic monarchs of Spain and to Portugal, and the monarchs had to care for the evangelization of the people they would encounter. Military conquests in North and South America were followed by the expansion of Catholic religious orders, which aimed not only at spreading the good news of the gospel, but at civilizing the indigenous people and turning them into subjects of the Spanish crown. Interestingly, due to abuses against the indigenous populations, some missionaries turned into the most important defenders of indigenous rights, and the Spanish crown took time to hold a moral debate on the treatment of indigenous people in the Americas to ensure the king's conscience would remain free of guilt. This famous Valladolid debate in 1550 and 1551 was followed by interdiction of active military expansion in 1573, and adjacent territories had to be explored in a more peaceful way. Anyway, this early modern colonial rule in the Americas began to end with the independence of the United States in 1776, which helped to inspire the independence movements in Spanish viceroyalties further south. And 50 years later, most of them had turned into independent states that pursued their own nation-building programs. And due to the influence of new secular philosophies and ideologies, the period of independence meant a major break with the Catholic Church in Latin America, and often went hand in hand with the oppression of religious orders. But especially towards the end of the 19th century, missionaries became more important again, not in the context of expansion, but within the framework of national programs, which aimed at the cultural and economic integration of certain areas and populations in the territories. There were processes of internal colonization in which indigenous people were either expelled and killed or forced to assimilate. It is in this context where missionaries often were asked to develop their actions among indigenous groups all over the continent because they were expected to achieve a peaceful assimilation and integration. And interestingly, many missionaries came again from European countries, Protestants as well as Catholics, and maybe especially Catholics during the last decades of the 19th century, because they had to struggle politically in the so-called Kulturkampf in Germany and in similar political conflicts in other European countries. Anyhow, these missionary activities continued well into the second half of the 20th century and went hand in hand with ethnographic works and collecting. And now, in general terms, missionary collecting in the Americas, from the cases I have been studying, seems to be pretty much informed by the interests of individuals that were either engaged actively as missionaries in the field and motivated by a personal interest in ethnographic artifacts, or they were members that wanted to build up missionary exhibitions or museums in Europe for promotional purposes. In the latter case, these people regularly asked the missionaries in the field to send them certain objects or types of objects, but their influence on what exactly would be sent to them was rather limited. In contrast, missionaries that collected things on their own initiative could do so with a hobby interest or with a more professional background. And now I would like to address the example of the written source, which is displayed here on the screen. It is an article that was published in 1932 in the periodical of the Franciscan province of Santo Antonio in northern Brazil. And as you can see, it is written in German, and this has to do with the politics towards religious orders in Brazil in the 19th century, because there was a period in which orders and congregations were not allowed to accept novices, and after some decades they were almost dying out. And when these restrictions were removed, the old Franciscan provinces in Brazil had to rely on personnel from abroad to recover and revive. This is one of the reasons why the Franciscan province of St. Anthony in northeast Brazil tried to establish a college in Germany where missionaries would be trained and later sent to work in Brazil. They achieved a permit in the location at the periphery of the Franciscan Saxonia province in Germany, close to the Dutch border in Bad Bentheim-Bardel. The new monastery was built in 1922, and the first mission museum was opened there already in 1926-27. Its founding was, above all, due to Father Clemens Anheuser, a German who first studied in the Netherlands and did his novitiate and further studies in Brazil. In 1926, he had to return to Germany for health reasons and dedicated himself to the Mission Museum and the Stamp Museum in Basel. The objects that were exhibited in Basel had come from another museum which the Franciscans had set up in Bahia before in Brazil, and which contained an ethnographic collection as well as botanical, zoological, and mineralogical specimens. The text that Anheuser published is quite interesting because he emphasizes above all the scientific purpose of his museum in Basel. First, he places ethnography and natural history in a long tradition of Franciscan individuals going back to the 16th century. He also states that a good understanding of God's creation is useful for pastoral work and that the museum should arouse the students' interest in Brazil's nature. He further says that the scientific work carried out by missionaries plays an important role in supporting Christian science at universities where Catholic scholars still had to deal with Darwinism and need material evidence for their investigations. And finally, he mentions the colleges of the Society of the Divine World in Steil and St. Gabriel, Austria, as best practice examples of missionary training that support natural history studies. A second purpose of the Mission Museum in Basel, according to Anheuser, was the promotion of the missionary's profession and the attraction of novices. Written words are not enough any longer, he states, and a rich museum collection is a perfect means of propaganda. Finally, Anheuser gives a short overview of the current collection in Basel, but demands his brothers in Brazil to collect and to send him much more, as they were located so close to the source. He also gives practical instructions for proper conservation and packaging of ethnographic objects and natural history specimens. All in all, Anheuser's objective was a comprehensive museum collection that would meet scientific standards. Well, and how ethnographic artifacts had been or were to be acquired from indigenous people is unfortunately not mentioned. But the comprehensive aim would obviously mean that all kinds of objects, including sensible ones, should find their way to the museum in Basel. What the collection actually comprised before parts of it were destroyed during the Second World War still needs to be investigated. So, and this is where I would like to leave it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Markus, for this example of the Catholic missionaries and yeah, the perspective of collecting for a mission museum. I will end now the presentation so we can see each other better. And yes, I thank you all for these great examples that definitely, I guess, will prove a good starting point for discussion. And yeah, Markus, you already mentioned that the manner of collecting Bible missionaries is unfortunately not documented in the sources, but maybe are there any cases of reactions by documented of reactions by collecting from missionaries to these objects? I guess, for example, yeah, the cases Ohini mentioned, I guess they show as well a certain point of violence in missionary forms of collecting or conversion.
Well, from the sources I've seen until the moment, I haven't, unfortunately, clear examples, but in a broader sense, indigenous people in the Americas obviously have to deal with the with colonialism and the consequences until today. I mean, there is one example in the US. There is, for example, the Jesuit Census Mission on Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, which has a museum of ethnographic artifacts that dates back to the 1940s. And it even has the name of a German Jesuit that worked there and stood out for his linguistic works on the Lakota language. It's the Büchel Memorial Lakota Museum. And this is a museum with a collection that never left the community, but what is much more an urgent issue to the Lakota is the problem of mistreatment of indigenous children at the former boarding school that the Jesuits had run on the reservation. And currently there is a so-called Truth and Healing Commission. Another example which may be interesting is an ethnographic collection from Brazil, from Mato Grosso, from the Bororo Indians. There were Italian Salesian missionaries working there in the 20th, since the early 20th century, and they also gathered a collection of ethnographic artifacts, which they brought to Italy. But in 2001, many of these items were returned actually to an indigenous village in Mato Grosso in order to make up an indigenous museum. And so it is still an issue. And these, when I've talked to representative of indigenous peoples from the Americas, there is an interest in at least knowing about these items and having the opportunity to get in touch again with this material heritage. No? So it is an issue, independently maybe of a question of how things were actually acquired or not, because they are missing for them.
Thank you, Markus. Yes, and Gabriele, I was wondering, in the case of communities converting to Christianity, in how far it is possible to point out the agency or interests of the communities to, maybe there are some interests why we should convert to Christianity, or you mentioned the competing interest of Catholic missionaries and Protestant missions, so maybe you can point out to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that is really an angle to think about, because why should I talk about, the interests of the Papua New Guinean community to convert? I mean, I do know about gifts, and it's like you could even the missionaries would say, well, they are interested in us because we have so much and all that. But this is sort of an outsider perspective, saying something about a motivation. I can't really, I'm not. It's not my position to say why they converted. I can only say what are the narratives of the missionary, or what did he preach in order for them to be against, for instance, items like the stones or the flutes or whatever items which motivated them to give them away. So it's a little bit tricky for me to sort of say, well, maybe they got it wrong, why they converted. Oh, there was a lot of colonial pressure and the mission society was maybe the better option. I don't know. Maybe, it's like I can't judge from the outside. What I can say is that as long as you stick to the missionaries' narrative, what is heathendom and what is just tradition and cultural, if you go along with the divide and conquer, so to say, this is religion, this has to be eliminated, this is culture, this is okay. There you can say, well, there's a problem, because what is that that is sort of the European lens on a local tradition that maybe not today the same communities would agree to, and I mean, from what I learned this summer, much more than before, you need to have a discussion of people. You need to have, you know, you need to bring people together to find out what is now the common sense. What would be a community in Papua New Guinea nowadays? Thinking about those items, and what are the needs today? What are common narratives? And common narratives take time and effort, and in this case, long distance traveling. If you have an exchange between Papua New Guinea and Germany, and you would have to make an extra effort to get at where are the needs of communities nowadays, with regards to stones or whatever other items involved. Yeah.
We'll use the chance if any of you would like to join the working group on missionary collections, just send me an email, and Markus and I are happy to discuss with you later. And yeah, thank you, and I wish you all a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting conversation, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Same from here. Bye.
Thanks to you all. Bye bye.